This isn't a story I tell often, because looking back, it feels like it happened to someone else, in another life. But it was my life, and every single word of it is true. The mahogany table in the conference room of Finch, Abernathy and Sloane was so polished I could see my own exhausted reflection in it, a distorted stranger staring back from the 40th floor overlooking Boston Harbor. My uncle, Alistair, sat opposite me, a portrait of tailored arrogance, his smirk as sharp and cruel as the crease in his trousers. He was there to witness the final nail in my father's coffin, and by extension, my own. The lawyer, a man whose suit cost more than my car, cleared his throat and read from my grandfather's will, his voice a droning finality. The vast Finch estate, the stocks, the portfolios, the sprawling Cape Cod retreat, it all went to his loyal son, Alistair. And then he came to me. To Jack Riley, the son of the disgraced black sheep, I was bequeathed a single property, a dilapidated, condemned brownstone on a forgotten corner of Beacon Hill. The moment the lawyer finished, Alistair leaned across that vast, gleaming table, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. He left you the rot, just like your father. It's where you belong. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The flight from Portland had been a blur of recycled air and cheap coffee, a journey into a past I never really knew. My father, Alistair's younger brother, had died 10 years prior, a man my grandfather had long since written off as a failure. We never spoke of the Boston side of the family. They were a myth, a source of a deep, unspoken pain in my father's eyes. He was a history professor at a small community college, a man who found more value in dusty books than in stock tickers. Alistair, on the other hand, had wrapped himself in the family name, transforming their old manufacturing business into a real estate empire that had its steel and glass fingers all over the city. When the call came that my grandfather had passed, I felt a flicker of something. Not grief, but a historian's curiosity. A pull toward an origin story I'd been denied. Now, sitting in that sterile office, I understood. I wasn't summoned to be welcomed back into the fold. I was summoned to be formally cast out, to be handed the scraps and shown the door, a final lesson in the family hierarchy. Alistair stood up, buttoned his jacket, and gave me a dismissive glance. The keys are with the lawyer. I'd advise you to sell it for scrap. It's the only value you'll ever get out of it. He walked out without another word, leaving me with nothing but the echo of his cruelty and the address to a ruin. I took a cab to Beacon Hill, my mind numb. The address led me to a narrow, cobblestone street, a relic of old Boston. And there it was. A 4-story brownstone, proud but wounded. Its windows were boarded up, its iron railings rusted, a bright orange condemnation notice slapped on the heavy oak door like a public shaming. It looked exactly like what Alistair had called it, rot. But as I stood there on that uneven sidewalk, a strange feeling washed over me. It felt less like an insult and more like a secret. I got the keys, a heavy ring of antique brass, and let myself in. The air inside was thick and cold, smelling of dust, decaying paper, and a century of trapped silence. Sunlight struggled through the grime on a high fanlight window, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the grand foyer. Everything was draped in white sheets, creating ghostly sculptures of furniture long past its prime. It was a mausoleum. My inheritance wasn't a property, it was a tomb. I walked through the cavernous rooms, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. It was easy to see why the city had condemned it. There were cracks in the plaster, water stains blooming across the ceilings, and a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This place needed to be gutted or demolished. Alistair was right. Selling for scrap was the only logical move. I was a high school history teacher from Oregon. I didn't have the money or the know-how to save a place like this. I was ready to call a realtor, to cut my losses and retreat back to my simple, quiet life. I went upstairs to what must have been the master study. It was lined with empty bookshelves, and a massive mahogany desk sat facing a window that overlooked a small, overgrown garden. I ran my hand over the desk, the last piece of furniture not covered by a sheet, and my fingers caught on something, a subtle indentation on the underside. I knelt down and felt around. A small, wooden button, almost perfectly camouflaged in the grain. I pressed it. With a soft click, a thin side panel of the desk drawer popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a long, yellowed envelope sealed with wax, bearing my grandfather's crest. My name, Jackson, was written on it in a shaky, but determined, hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was something more. This wasn't part of the public will reading. This was a message from the grave. I broke the seal. Inside was a heavy, ornate key and a single sheet of folded paper. The letter was short, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of regret. Jackson, it began, Alistair is a thief and a liar. He ruined your father, and he has been stealing from me for 30 years. I am too old and too weak to fight him, but I have gathered the stones for you to build the slingshot. He thinks this house is your inheritance. He is wrong. It is your fortress. The key is for a box at the Old Colony Trust Bank. The real legacy is in there. Don't mourn me. Avenge your father. The words on that page rearranged my entire world. My father, the gentle, bookish man I knew, wasn't a failure. He was a victim. Alistair, the titan of Boston industry, wasn't a success story. He was a predator. My grandfather, the distant, cold figure from my childhood, hadn't abandoned us. He had been plotting, laying the groundwork for a war he couldn't fight himself. The dilapidated house wasn't a parting insult, it was a bunker, a headquarters. The key in my hand felt impossibly heavy, a cold piece of metal that could unlock a truth powerful enough to shatter an empire. For the first time, I felt a connection to this place, to this family. It was a legacy not of wealth, but of deferred justice. A rage, cold and clear, began to burn away my confusion. My first move was to rescind the tentative call I'd made to a demolition company. My second was to find a lawyer, not a corporate shark like Alistair's, but a bulldog, someone who wasn't afraid of a bloody fight. But Alistair was already moving. Within a week, the first official notice arrived, a lawsuit to contest the will on the grounds of my grandfather's supposed senility, claiming I had exerted undue influence on a confused old man. It was a lie, of course. I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in 15 years. But Alistair had the best legal team in Boston, and they knew how to weave a compelling fiction. Then came the city inspectors. A sudden, coordinated swarm of them. Fire, plumbing, electrical, structural. They descended on the brownstone with grim faces and long checklists, finding violations that had been ignored for decades. Each citation came with an exorbitant fine and an impossible deadline. It was a transparent, brutal strategy, bleed me dry and bury me in bureaucracy until I had no choice but to surrender the property to him. He was trying to prove his own point, that I belonged in the rot, and that I, like the house, would crumble under pressure. The Boston papers picked up the story, painting me as a greedy interloper from the West Coast, a vulture picking at a respected family's bones. Alistair gave a sanctimonious interview, speaking of his deep sadness over his father's final, confused days and his desire to preserve the family's integrity. He was untouchable, a philanthropic giant whose name was carved onto museum wings and university libraries. I was a nobody. The city was his chessboard, and I was a lone, insignificant pawn about to be swept off the board. I was running out of money, and the legal fees were piling up. For a few dark days, I felt the crushing weight of his power, the certainty of my defeat. I almost gave in. I sat alone in the dusty study, the stack of violation notices and legal threats on the desk beside me, and I felt the last of my hope draining away. Then, my eyes fell on my grandfather's letter. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, and read his final words again. Don't mourn me. Avenge your father. In that moment, something inside me hardened. The fear and despair curdled into a diamond-hard resolve. Alistair wanted a war? He would get one. But I wouldn't fight him on his terms, in his courtroom, with his rules. I would fight him from the shadows, with the one weapon he didn't know I had, the truth. The next morning, I walked into the Old Colony Trust Bank, a bastion of old money in the heart of the financial district. The building itself felt like a vault, cold and silent, smelling of brass polish and century-old secrets. I presented the key and my ID. A stern-faced manager led me down to the basement, through a gate of crisscrossed steel bars that looked like it could withstand a direct missile strike. He used his key, then mine, and pulled out a long, narrow safe deposit box made of battered tin. He left me alone in a small, private viewing room with paneled walls and a single, unforgiving light overhead. My hands were shaking as I opened the box. It didn't contain stock certificates or piles of cash. Instead, it was filled with about a dozen hardbound accountant's ledgers, the kind with green and white striped pages. And on top of them, a small, worn leather-bound book, like a diary. I opened the first ledger. The pages were dense with dates, names, and numbers, all written in my grandfather's meticulous, spidery script. It looked like gibberish at first, columns of figures next to company names I'd never heard of: Heir Holdings, Trident Maritime LLC, North Star Acquisitions. It was a meticulous record of 30 years of transactions, a shadow history of the Finch Empire. Then I opened the small leather book. It wasn't a diary. It was a cipher. It contained the key to understanding the ledgers. Heir Holdings was a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. Trident Maritime was a front for transferring funds to corrupt city officials. Every cryptic entry in the ledgers was a piece of a massive, intricate puzzle of embezzlement, bribery, and fraud. My grandfather hadn't just been watching Alistair, he had been documenting every single crime. He had built the case, brick by painstaking brick. This was the slingshot. The stones were all here. But I was a historian, not a financial investigator. I could spend a lifetime trying to decipher these books and still miss the crucial connections. I knew I needed help. I needed someone who spoke this language of deceit, someone who could follow the dark money and wasn't afraid of whose door they ended up at. Finding that person was my next challenge. I couldn't go to a major firm, Alistair's influence ran too deep. I needed an outsider, someone hungry, someone with as much to prove as I had. I spent days in the Boston Public Library, not in the history section, but in the business archives, cross-referencing names from the ledger with old news articles. I was looking for a ghost, a financial analyst or accountant who had gotten too close to a powerful person and been burned for it. And then I found her. A woman named Elena Morales. A forensic accountant who had been a rising star at a huge firm until she uncovered a massive fraud scheme involving a state senator. Her firm buried the report, fired her to appease their powerful client, and she'd been working for herself out of a tiny office near the North End ever since. She was brilliant, and she had a grudge against the very system that protected men like my uncle. She was perfect. I found her office above a pastry shop, the smell of cannolis heavy in the air. Elena was sharp, skeptical, her eyes missing nothing. I didn't tell her everything, not at first. I just pushed one of the ledgers and the cipher book across her cluttered desk. "I need to know what this means," I said. She opened the ledger, her eyes scanning the pages with an unnerving intensity. For a long time, she was silent. Then she looked up at me, and for the first time, a flicker of something dangerous ignited in her gaze. "Mr. Riley," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Where did you get this?" Elena became the general of my secret war. We turned the top floor of the brownstone into our command center, spreading the ledgers out across the dusty floor, taping flowcharts and names to the peeling wallpaper. The house, Alistair's symbol of my decay, was now the very engine of his destruction. For weeks, we worked in a feverish state, fueled by cheap takeout and a shared, burning purpose. Elena was a virtuoso. She moved through the columns of numbers like a composer reading a score, finding the rhythm in the fraud, the harmony in the hidden accounts. She translated my grandfather's cryptic notes into a devastating narrative of greed. Alistair hadn't just been skimming off the top, he had built a shadow empire. He used shell corporations to buy condemned properties, like this very brownstone, then used his political connections to get them rezoned, selling them back to his own company at an enormous markup, all while using laundered money that he was embezzling from the employee pension fund. He hadn't just ruined my father, he'd been stealing from thousands of working people for decades. The scale of it was breathtaking. As we dug deeper, Alistair's attacks grew more desperate. The legal pressure intensified. One night, I came back to the brownstone to find the front door locks busted, the place tossed. It wasn't a robbery, it was a message. They didn't take anything. They were looking for something. They were looking for the ledgers. After that, I moved the books to a secure storage unit every night. The siege was tightening. Elena started getting anonymous, threatening calls at her office. We both knew we were running out of time. Alistair was a cornered animal, and he was getting ready to bite. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday, just after 2 a.m. Elena let out a sharp, triumphant gasp. "I found it," she whispered, her voice electric. "The keystone. The one mistake he made." She pointed to a transaction from 8 years ago, a wire transfer from one of his Cayman Islands accounts. The recipient wasn't another shell corporation. It was a direct payment to a federally appointed judge who had, 1 week later, dismissed a major class action lawsuit against Finch Properties. It was a clean, direct, undeniable act of federal bribery. It was the kill shot. We had him. But Elena cautioned me. Handing this to the authorities wasn't enough. Alistair would bury it in legal motions for years. His lawyers would muddy the waters, discredit us, and he might walk away with a slap on the wrist. "Men like Alistair don't just need to be jailed," she said, her eyes dark. "They need to be dismantled. Publicly. We have to destroy the one thing he truly loves, his reputation." And she was right. Justice wasn't enough. I wanted vengeance. We needed a stage. And I knew the perfect one, the annual Finch Foundation Charity Gala, the crown jewel of the Boston social season. It was the one night a year where Alistair put his manufactured integrity on full display for the city's elite. It was his coronation. And this year, it would be his execution. The night of the gala was a classic Boston autumn evening, crisp and clear. The event was being held at the Boston Public Library, a temple of knowledge that Alistair was about to desecrate with his lies. We had spent the last 2 weeks preparing our attack with the precision of a military operation. Elena had compiled everything into a single, devastating digital file, copies of the ledgers, the wire transfer confirmation, a clear and concise explanation of the entire money laundering scheme, and a heartbreaking impact statement from a former employee whose pension had vanished. I, in turn, had leveraged my quiet historian skills, digging up the contact information for every board member of every charity Alistair supported, every major investor in his company, and, most importantly, every senior reporter at every news outlet from Boston to New York. We set up a dead man's switch on an encrypted email server. At 9 p.m., the exact moment Alistair was scheduled to take the stage to give his keynote address on corporate responsibility and the modern family, the email would be sent. To everyone. I wasn't there to see it. That felt too much like his kind of gloating. Instead, I stood across the street in Copley Square, hidden in the shadows of Trinity Church, watching the black cars pull up to the library's grand entrance. I saw the flash of cameras, the glitter of jewels, the parade of Boston's most powerful people, all there to pay tribute to a king on a throne of lies. My phone was connected to a live news feed. At 9:01 p.m., my screen refreshed. The headline from the Boston Globe was the first to hit: Finch empire built on decades of fraud and corruption, leaked documents reveal. A moment later, another alert, this time from a national outlet. Then another. It was a digital firestorm. Through the grand, arched windows of the library, I could see the sudden change. The calm, polite applause for Alistair, who was on stage at the podium, faltered. A blue glow began to illuminate the faces in the crowd as, one by one, they looked down at their phones. A murmur swelled into a panicked roar. I watched Alistair's posture change. His confident, smug stance stiffened. He saw the looks on their faces, the whispers, the horrified stares. His own phone, sitting on the podium, began to vibrate violently, buzzing across the wood. His carefully constructed world was dissolving around him in real time, under the hot glare of the stage lights. His face, projected onto massive screens on either side of the stage, was a mask of confusion, then dawning, sickening horror. The final act was not mine. Flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of the block, cutting through the darkness. 2 black sedans, the kind that don't have municipal logos on the side, pulled up silently behind the line of limousines. Men in dark suits got out. FBI. They walked calmly up the library steps and through the ornate doors, parting the panicked crowd like sharks. The live feed I was watching cut to a reporter outside, breathless, shouting over the sirens. The camera zoomed in on the entrance. And then I saw him. Alistair, his face pale and slack with shock, being escorted out by the federal agents. The flashbulbs were blinding now, a frantic, merciless assault. They weren't the adoring flashes of the society pages anymore, they were the flashes of the hungry press, capturing the final, ignominious image of a fallen man. I watched until they put him in the car and drove away. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt quiet. The scales were balanced. Months have passed. The legal battles were loud but swift, the evidence was too overwhelming for even Alistair's lawyers to spin. His assets were frozen, his company dismantled, and he now resides in a federal penitentiary, stripped of his name, his power, and his freedom. The story of his downfall became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms and country clubs where he was once worshipped. The pension fund was partially restored from his seized assets, a small measure of justice for the people he'd robbed. As for me, I never went back to Portland. I stayed in Boston. I used a small, legally protected portion of the inheritance, one my grandfather had set aside for me years before Alistair could touch it, to slowly and painstakingly restore the brownstone. The condemnation notices are gone, the windows are clear, and the rust has been scoured from the ironwork. It's no longer a fortress or a tomb. It's my home. I spend most of my time in the study, my grandfather's study, looking out the window at the quiet, cobblestone street. The ledgers are gone, locked away as evidence in a government vault, but I don't need them anymore. The truth they held is now public record, a permanent stain on a tarnished legacy. I did what I came here to do. I cleared my father's name, and in doing so, I found a part of myself I never knew existed. I don't think about Alistair often, but sometimes, when the house is quiet at night, I think about the 2 legacies. The one he tried to build with stolen money and polished lies, and the one he left me, born of decay and secrets. He thought he had buried my father's name in shame, but I used his own fortune to carve it into his tombstone. The end.